morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special panel, if you don't mind me saying so. The Gulf Crisis, the role of the world powers. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and I'm honored to chair this panel with distinguished friends and guests here and colleagues, and definitely honored to be invited to this conference and to have this role in it. First, let me just say a couple of words with regards to the topic and invite my colleagues on the panel to try to include in their remarks maybe a couple of questions that I would like to propose to them. The role of the world powers in the Gulf crisis, which is the subject of this whole conference, has been a very distinct and very important role. Since the beginning, actually, of this crisis, I believe that the reaction of the superpowers, or if we want to call them the global powers, which is probably a better term, has in a way influenced, if you will, the parameters of the Gulf crisis. And it did, in many ways, surprise the boycotting nations, because they assumed that most of the boycotting nations are going to side with the boycotters at this time. And of course, they underestimated also the role of Qatari diplomacy and also the role of the Kuwaiti mediation that gave additional legitimacy, if you will, to the answer that was given by the world power. And not having the anticipated response globally, it tended to kind of take, if you will, the bite out of the boycott in many ways and undermine it. I think it did have that effect. In my humble judgment, I believe probably that the global power reaction to the crisis, the Gulf crisis, was the second most influential component of this crisis. The first one, again, in my judgment, that was very surprising and ended up changing the nature of this conflict, was the domestic, the internal Qatari reaction. I think the boycotters were totally surprised by the cohesion that they met from the Qatari people in responding to this crisis. I think some of them naively anticipated or expected an internal collapse, maybe, in the country. They underestimated and the reaction that took place by the Qatari people in a very instinctive, very natural way, rallying behind their leadership and remaining focused, not falling apart under duress or as a result of the psychological or the emotional, particularly first wave of the crisis. I think personally that these two elements, they're not the only two. I'm sure we can list maybe a dozen more reasons or components to this crisis. But I would say the domestic response internally plus the international response globally contributed to somehow delimiting or establishing the parameters that we see now in the crisis. It is stalemated. We have not reached, and that reaction, whether it's domestic or the international, did not necessarily contribute thus far to a solution, even though there has been widespread support for the Kuwaiti mediation in this crisis and the rational position of other countries in the region and beyond. But unfortunately, the crisis is still with us. That's why we're here this weekend to discuss it and to study it and to see if we could somehow contribute and understand better the reasons for that absence of solution thus far. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to ask if they could, in their remarks, even kind of at the last minute, extemporaneously, add to their oral discussion some remarks about the positions that we have witnessed thus far internationally. Are these, I want to ask like 3 questions that I would like him to take into consideration as they make their remarks. The first one, are these positions taken internationally, whether it's the American position, whether it's the Russian position, whether it's the German position, whether it's the EU position in general, are these positions taken as principled position? Was it something like based on attachment to international law, commitment against boycott in general as a practice in principle, or was it simply realpolitik? Was it simply basically these countries looking at their national interest and realizing that this boycott does not serve their national interest? Or third option, was it basically that these countries universally kind of adapted or accepted the conventional wisdom that this region in the world is very important region, as everybody describes it, as strategically important reasons for countries in the region and countries beyond, and therefore they viewed the boycott as a possible attempt to undermine in the long term the stability of the region, and therefore they opposed it. So we have these 3 choices, and I would be curious for each one of our speakers to kind of refer to see where their country that they are focusing on somehow fit within that model. We have 4 great speakers participating in this panel. They have submitted very strong papers with regards to their specialty, and I will introduce them in the order I would like for them to address you, and then we will go from there. I will not read their bios because otherwise we'll be here till next Friday, and I will just briefly mention the highlights of their careers so that you can fit them in the right perspective. You can see their CVs or part of their, in the program, part of their background and their contributions to Gulf studies and to Arab studies in general throughout their careers. We're going to start with the US position, which I think played a very, very important role in setting the parameters for this crisis. And our presenter will be Dr. John Duke Anthony, a well-known name in Gulf studies and in the Gulf region in general. He is the founder and the executive president of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, one of the most well-known NGO in Washington, focusing on U.S.-Arab relations, with an emphasis particularly on trade relations, political relations, the security or strategic relationship between the United States and the Arab world. I would like to add, in terms of relevance to policy, that my friend John also serves on a couple of committees right now, advising the State Department. He's a member of the Consultative Committee on Economic Policy, International Economic Policy. So the group advises the Secretary of State on what U.S. policy should be economically vis-a-vis the international community. He's a specialist, as I said, in Middle East studies, particularly in Gulf strategic relationship. Our next speaker will be Sergey Strokan, and Sergey is a geopolitical analyst, a journalist by profession. He's a well-known name in media circles, and over the past dozen years has been a well-recognized name in terms of many broadcasts that he hosted and special programs that he did, including his famous program called Al-Khatt Al-Ahmar, the Red Line, that was broadcast by Sputnik International, if I'm not mistaken. And he's a well-known name in international media. He appears regularly on CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, Sputnik International, and others. To my right, we have Jeremias Kettner, who will be speaking on the German case with regards to the crisis in the Gulf. And he's also a political analyst and a strategic consultant. He's an expert in intergovernmental relations, both with regards to, of course, German politics and particularly German foreign policy. And currently, he is finishing his doctoral coursework and dissertation on German-Qatari relations at the Free University, German University in Berlin. Last but not least is my colleague and my good friend, Ahmed Qasem Hussein. Ahmed is a researcher here at the Arab Center in Doha, and where he edits Siyasat Arabiya, Arab Politics, one of the academic journals of the center. He holds a doctorate degree in international relations from Florence University in Italy. So at this point, I would like to invite Dr. Anthony, John, if you don't mind, starting our panel.
Great. Thank you very much. Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Khalil. And profound questions that Khalil asked deserve equally profound response right at the beginning. The answer to the first one is yes. The second one, it's no. And the third one, it's mixed. It's a bit too early to say.
Thank you very much,
but
John,
there we are.
For your presentation. Next speaker.
Great. All right. In terms of the Trump administration and the foundations and the networks and the frameworks within which the administration is trying to formulate its policies, its positions, and let the public know about its attitudes and actions on these things. Most people are confused about most of those questions and frames of reference, so there's nothing unusual about that, but let's hope we can shed some light on it as we go. My remarks will be divided essentially into three, and that is the past, the present, and what looks like the near-term potential future with regard to trends and indications and patterns that one can discern, all of which is open for debate. Now, as to the first one, I thought it was helpful to start right off in response to some who have said directly, others by allusion, that the United States has no strategy, or its strategy is confused, or it seems to be absent. No, I take issue with all three of those. There is a strategy, or strategies, plural. There's been a strategy, certainly on the United States side, from the administrative executive branch for the last 60, going on 70 years. And I can prove that, I believe, in any extended debate. But that's where I'm coming from there. And so if you want to refer to those strategies as being formulated, agreed to, and largely implemented or administered by the executive branch or the deep state, that's a phrase that some have used, that's fine, because these are the unsung heroes and heroines. These are the ones who work to provide the glue, the adhesive, the lubricant of the wheels of government, so that we don't go off the rails more than we have and are likely to do were they not to exist. Now, what are these interests that the deep state and the executive branch have been agreeing on consultatively and consensually? So that resonates with the two basic political precepts here in Arab and Islamic culture. And because in graduate school there were so many people that tried to make points for themselves by saying this is in our national security and related interests, or they tried to shut somebody else up by saying, why would we do that? This is not in our national security or related interest. So interest kept coming up, and I thought that that's a valuable concept, but it needs to be somewhat defined, or at least not subject to a wide-ranging debate. So I began to discipline myself, starting in 1968, every 4 years, to ask up to 20 people tasked with administering America's national interests as they pertain to the Arab countries, the Middle East, and the Islamic world. And so I went into these discussions, interviews, conversations with my own half-baked ideas, biases, perhaps an unconscious or unadmitted ideological tilt here or there. This was the 60s, and the Vietnam War was still uncertain as to its conflict resolution there. I was surprised by the answers that were given to me by many people. I disagreed with them, but in honesty and trying to be a truthful scholar on this matter, I have tried to faithfully report what they replied. And what has impressed me, because we're talking about 68 now to right through 2016, that the essential interests have been 5. And they've not been any 5. And the 5 had largely remained the same, although 2 sets of them have changed, and I'll give which ones they were and why and when there. The most basic and overarching of all the interests that just about everybody articulated was a set of strategic or grand strategic interests. They're so obvious that people look past them, don't think of them consciously hour to hour, let alone even day to day. And these are the strategic interests in avoiding war, ending wars, preventing wars, and winding down wars on one hand, and the other side of the coin is to prolong peace, to prepare for peace, to administer peace, to implement peace, and to sustain peace. These trump just about everything else, and just about everything else largely has come under those strategic goals, aspirations, needs, concerns, interests, okay? And if you want examples of that, we're talking about the closure of the Hormuz Straits under the British and the French, the closure of the Suez Canal. They went to the war over that. In the future, perhaps the closure of the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. In the last days of the Kuwait crisis of 1991, the torching of more than 700 oil wells in Kuwait by the departing Iraqi troops, with lifting hand from some collaborators. So those would be some examples there. The second one has been economic. And the economic one now is reduced to sheer access to the region's resources that relate to the engine that drive all the world's economies, big, small, in between, new and old and thin and sturdy, etc. No economy in the world, no matter how wealthy or poor, can run or does run absent energy, okay? So that one, too, is pretty basic. But it used to be wrapped up until the mid-'70s with banking, with commerce, with trade, with investment, with joint ventures. But it was separated out in the mid-'70s and left by itself the sheer access to it and all that it implies with regard to the hydrocarbon fuels, which is the primary access to which, a resource to which the United States and other great powers have wanted to have access there. Though changes have been coming there too, but lots of misleading implications from them when people say, oh, because of fracking technologies, and the United States is off and on one of the world's leading producers of petroleum, et cetera, that this area is no longer needed. The diplomatic answer would be BS, and I won't have to spell it out there. The third one is the most troublesome and politically complex because it is political there. And you can put an asterisk beside this one because there has been an ironclad devotion, at least, albeit rhetorical, more than actual in numerous cases, of non-interference in the domestic affairs of one another's countries there. And of course, in the last 5 years, or since the onset of Arab Spring, this has been an aberration. But aberrations and exceptions are just that, aberrations and exceptions there. This is where the United States has the greatest difficulty because it's seen as a hypocrite, it's seen as audacious, it's seen as double standards, It is seen as contradictory. It's seen as provocative. It's seen as antagonistic, even pugilistic. We had a president or two ago that said, "Bring them on there." So this is the troublesome one. We can come back to that and see where others are coming from. The fourth one is a set of commercial interests, and this one was separated out in the mid-'70s because of the last Arab oil embargo against those countries seen unduly supportive of Israel while it was an occupation of Arab and Islamic lands and Palestinian Christian lands as well. And because the United States was then, as now, the world's single largest consumer of hydrocarbon fuels, depletable, exhaustible as it is, the single largest importer still, even with the fracking, the U.S. remains the world's #1 importer of it. The single biggest wasters, therefore environmentalists, come into that play, and the single loudest crybabies in terms of the terms of trade and America's relationship with it. I mean, if the price of oil goes up 10 cents, people just about think, are you going to march tomorrow in the streets and protest this? Versus the situation in Brussels or Antwerp or Tokyo or London, virtually any other place than the United States, where if we were to go tonight, we Americans, and say, fill her up, it'd be 3, 4, in a few cases, 5 times what it is in the United States. And the people in those countries do not make nearly a fraction even as big a deal as Americans do. So that's just commentary there on the side. But the view was, in order to lessen the net bill of having to import an increasingly pricey oil and to a lesser extent gas, when the price doubled, trebled, quadrupled, quintupled, sextupled, etc., twice in the 1970s, the thought was we have to export as much as we can in order to sell our goods, our services, our products, our technology, let more into our schools and universities as full, fair playing students in the higher education realm, and that'll make a difference. This is still the marching orders in the Department of State. I sit on 2 of the committees there, and before President Obama began his last term, he said, all right, let me be completely clear here. We must double the level of America's exports in the next 4 years before I leave the White House. And we did, but not by accident, not by coincidence, because of what? Vision, will, determination, and a fortuitous set of circumstances there. Let's see, 3 minutes when I thought I had about 5 more to go. That's all right. The last set is a set of defense cooperation interest here. And this has been separated out because it too was part of the commercial and the economic ones. And if you needed reminders of that in the most recent visit of President Trump to Riyadh last May, there were tens of billions of contracts, at least initialed or pledged, whether they'll be fulfilled is something else. But that linked the economic interest, the commercial interest, and the aerospace and defense industries, defense cooperation interest all together. And the visit itself linked the strategic and the political interest together. So all 5 of them were addressed in one visit over, 72 hours there. It's often that one can kill 2 birds with 1 stone, but seldom, if ever, that one can kill 5 of them with 1 stone there. So this should provide a frame of reference for what has been in place since World War II. It is still in place. And I just gave them in the order and the ranking of priorities. Note, if anybody was listening, that we didn't talk about the little D word, democratization. We didn't talk about human rights, civil rights, a whole set of other rights. And here's what confuses a lot of people, because we talk louder and longer about those interests than any of the others there. And we write more about them. More ink is spilled in pursuit of those interests. But I'm indebted to a former member of the Department of State's Policy Planning Council, William Polk, who's still alive. I think he's pushing 90 now, maybe more than that, who said that these interests, let's face it, are psychologically indulgible, make us feel good, and we're emotionally driven on these things. But at the end of the day, they're politically expendable. And pretty much that's the case if you stack them up against those five sets of interests that I mentioned. I'll sort of try to wind my remarks to a close here by saying there are pluses and minuses in all of this. We have more pluses than meets the eye, and we have more minuses than meet the eye there. There is a good, so far, kitchen cabinet around President Trump of people who are seasoned, who have requisite information, insight, knowledge, understanding, empathy, education, and empirical experience, and a capacity for critical reasoning. On the negative side is we don't have what the British had and still have, and they were the ones that laid in this framework, this network in the region. In terms of the language, we're having this conference secondarily in terms of the weights and the standards and the measures and the ways that the roads and the electricity and the water and the sewage, Americans can take credit for none of that. This was all laid in by the British, who took over from the Dutch, who took over from the Portuguese. But what we don't have, and it's hurt us big time, that the British have, is the anthropology aspect, the empathy aspects, the knowledge, the understanding, the appreciation, the accommodation, the use of tribes. In Great Britain, one doesn't grow up seeing cowboy and Indian movies. In America, one cannot grow up without having seen them there. And the psychological impact is massive, diffuse, and pervasive there. In the sense that tribes are seen as backward, illiberal, not progressive, swarthy, not exactly clean. They have a darker pigmentation skin hue there. The cowboys always won out, and they were always men, and they were always white. This hurt us big time in Iraq, and it has hurt us a lot in other issues as well. As to the near-term future, that is mixed and questionable, because you have around the president some spear-throwing major supporters of the Zionist project that are anxious to see Israeli interest prevail over American interest. And for the most part, for the last 60-some years, they've stopped nearly at nothing in order to pursue those interests. Thank you.
Go ahead. Thank you, John. Anytime I hear a speaker delineate the national interest of the United States in the region, I'm reminded of a quote by another foreign policy expert in Washington and from the old days, Seth Tillman, who worked for many years in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He said, when you look at the list of interests of the United States in the Arab region, they all look great when you look at them one at a time. There is no problem with them. The problem is when they're all start interacting with each other. And that's when you get all the contradictions that we face with regards to U.S. policy. Thank you very much, John. Sergey.
Okay. My presentation, as you know from the program, is devoted to Russia's relations with GCC countries. But before I start, I briefly respond to your questions, and maybe brief comment to what John said. You know, Mr. Chairman, I'm quite skeptical of the talk of global powers. I think that when we talk about global powers, we are driven by certain inertia. Since the very idea of global power has changed in the last years, and this is relevant to the role of global powers as such. See, let's take this, for example, the Sochi meeting on Syria, which can be seen as remote relevant to Yalta conference. Okay, we have Turkey, we have Iran, we have Russia. So where are the global powers? If we define global powers by big five of permanent veto holders. Where is the United States? Where is Britain? Where is France? Where is China? They're not there. So I think that while in the time of the Cold War, they were bipolar world, when we had Soviet Union, we had United States, then it was fashionable to talk about multipolar world, with global powers serving as a sort of centers of power. Now it is more appropriate to talk about non-polar world, which is less governed, more chaotic, and it is not global powers, but regional powers, which are entering the stage and which are making the show as such. And brief comment to what John said. So probably more than grain of salt than icing on the cake. But you said about the strategy, and you throw me away to defend. This United States has a strategy. Probably it has, but for us, it's sometimes difficult to see the strategy because, as we see it, at least in Moscow, we see a lot of inconsistency. Today you want the deal with Iran, tomorrow you don't want the deal with Iran. Today you want Paris climate agreement, tomorrow you don't want it. Today you want Trans-Pacific partnership, tomorrow you don't want. Today you want Jerusalem as the capital of Jewish state, tomorrow you don't have. So such a twist and turn around. And where is this deep state? Yes. It's the same people, the same people. In 2005 they do one thing, in 2007 they do another thing. So for us it's very difficult to understand this thing, okay? Yeah, so, and by the way, this Gulf crisis, the very fact that it is already more than half of a year, where is the role of global powers? Okay, let's forget about Russia, but why America? This is your key allies. You just, what you can do is just call for restraint and for common sense, that's all. So what I'm saying is that now we have to, probably this is a bitter assumption, but we have to understand that global powers probably have seen the limit of their influence in today's world. This is sad, but this is the reality. And now I'm getting to the subject of my presentation, which is Russia's GCC countries relations. I would not pretend that I have all the answer to all hot potato issues. I don't think even President Putin has the answers because the situation is in flux. The situation is very volatile. It is very changing, and some developments, even for us, are unexpected. Then that's why when we ask for comments, sometimes it's difficult for us to grasp what's going on. But still, I think that we have to agree that 2017 would go down into the history of Russia's relations with GCC countries as a watershed year that might be seen as a moment when the former deadlock is giving way to much-awaited period of trade growth, political contacts, and booming military technical sides. While all was progressing along a bumpy road, Russia's ties with GCC countries are nowadays passing through extremely dramatic period, even by their own standards, due to two major factors. The first is ongoing civil war in Syria, and the second, as you are well aware, unprecedented Gulf squabble over Qatar. Ironically, while there is less and less cooperation within the framework of the Gulf Cooperation Countries Alliance, and yesterday we had very critical comments on the alliance and its future, Moscow today is cautiously testing the waters for turning a new regional crisis into a new opportunity. As for Russia's relations with the Gulf monarchies, Moscow is trying to find the right key to fit the Gulf door, but let us be frank, it still doesn't know how to do it and where is the right key. And the new dilemma appears as such. Russia today can either try to build a comprehensive Gulf policy at a time when GCC is in shambles. This is one option. And the second option is to devolve it into a raft of bilateral relations with parallel regional tracks. A Russian-Qatari track, Russian-Saudi track, and other tracks. And also new opportunities can emerge as Moscow is struggling to work out an exit strategy from Syria, which can enable it to get out of the Syrian mud without losing face. The new Syrian ceasefire would have been possible without some sort of behind-the-scene diplomatic collaboration between Russia and the Gulf countries, particularly with Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Both of these monarchies exert varying degree of influence on a wide range of militant groups in Syria, whether you recognize them as terrorists or rebels or freedom fighters. Altogether, Russia is proving its viability as one of the balancing powers in Eurasia's 21st century. I'm not using the word global power, regional power, I'm just saying power, Mr. Chairman. Though Russia must be absolutely careful, to my mind, not to, so to say, bite off more than it can chew. Otherwise, it could undermine the very same delicate balance that it's worked so hard to build thus far. So, and let us just look into this in more details, starting with Russia's relations with Saudi Arabia. Since this year, we had the most dramatic changes in those relations. The historic visit of Saudi King Salman to Moscow this October came as the culmination of ongoing bilateral efforts and many rounds of quiet diplomacy, which were bypassed by most analysts but took place in recent years. These moves were aimed at bringing bilateral relations on the right track and not making them hostage to the Syrian crisis, what we've seen in recent years. Let me just remind our audience that during the Cold War, Russia's relations with Saudi Arabia were largely predetermined by the superpower rivalry that cast a long shadow over Moscow's efforts to consolidate its position in the Gulf and thus proved to be its troubled legacy. As Saudi Arabia developed a reputation of being the US-tested ally, the Kremlin could have hardly expected to transform the desert kingdom from a geopolitically hostile terrain into an oasis of mutually beneficial cooperation. The collapse of the Soviet Union was followed by a drastic revamp, at least the attempt of drastic revamping of Russia's new Gulf policy, which was no more determined by communist atheist ideology and the necessity to deter the US and its allies or client states at any cost. For its part, let us be frank, Saudi Arabia used the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Iron Curtain as a golden opportunity to consolidate its positions in the post-Soviet space populated by millions of Sunni Muslims in both Russia and in the former Soviet Central Asian Republic. The economy was also a decisive factor that pushed both sides to start the much awaited, though inevitably slow, dance. As a result, despite the long track record of estrangement between Russia and Saudi Arabia that still left many reasons to remain skeptical, the two sides tested the water for what could have been seen as a breakthrough in bilateral business ties. I will mention only one deal. In 2004, Russia's private oil company Lukoil signed a 40-year prospecting contract with Saudi Arabia's state petrol company Aramco, while Stroitran gas company won another lucrative tender to build an oil pipeline in the south of Saudi Arabia. Then President Putin made a seemingly breakthrough visit to Riyadh 10 years ago in 2007, which was aimed at giving bilateral relations a new steam. But what happened after that? After that, we've seen the war in Syria, and that really undermined all that legacy of rapprochement which we've seen after the collapse of the Soviet Union, since Saudi Arabia and Russia found themselves at odds over Syria, and the controversy is still there. But 2015 brought a sensational turnaround, which again came as a surprise to all of us, when one of the most powerful men in Saudi Arabia, the defense minister of Saudi Arabia, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, actually the person who is in charge, brought a delegation of businessmen in St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in June 2015. As I said, the visit raised eyebrows if we take into consideration that the ongoing Syrian war has brought Russia-Saudi relations to another historic low, as I said. And it was also important for Russia that actually we have not seen at the St. Petersburg Forum since we have found ourselves in the middle of the sanction war, any representatives of United States, Western countries, or their allies. But Saudi prince was there. However, the main surprise lied ahead. Later that year, in October 2015, again Prince Mohammed bin Salman came back to Russia for the second time in several months. That was really unimaginable for us. And this time he was going to the Black Sea resort of Sochi to meet President Putin. This time, apart from probing Moscow's resolution in backing the ruler in Damascus, another hot potato issue was what to do with Iran and to what extent Saudi Arabia can rely on Russia in handling Iran. Okay? 5 minutes. Okay. Too much to talk, but little time. Then. 1 second. Since we are running out of time, let me just bypass Iranian section and come straight to Doha then. Since Russia is trying to also, I was talking about balancing, so Russia, another balancing act is for Russia is between Riyadh and Doha. And now we are trying to unwrap Qatar puzzle as well as Saudi puzzle. As you know, Riyadh-led coalition led this unprecedented diplomatic war on Qatar. And I would be frank that what happened this summer took all of political pundits and experts in Russia by surprise, because what initially looked like an unbreakable union of Gulf monarchies, cemented by the shared goal of toppling President Assad in Syria, followed common policy, developed a deep crack inside. Until the Gulf diplomatic crisis broke out, as viewed through common Russian eyes, it looked as if there was no much of difference between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Sorry to say that, but this is true. Why is that? Both were often described by mainstream Russian media as, I'm quoting, terrorist sponsor states in Syria, which were also fueling radical Islamist movements in northern Caucasus republics, involved in covert subversive operations to undermine Russia's national security and spare Wahhabi ideas. This is the common perception in Russian media and political class. After that, again, we've seen another surprise, another big surprise, because this year was a year of big surprises. And Russia's old stereotypes on Qatar gradually faded away after Moscow discovered that once, so to say, hostile Qatar was isolated by Gulf neighbors for what was described as dragging its feet in their common policy on Iran, which was orchestrated by Riyadh. And the very fact that Qatar can side with Iran, which is enjoying close ties with Russia, changed a lot in Moscow's perception of Doha and persuaded it to abandon the former rigid approach which placed Qatar on the map of regional sponsors of terrorism. After the Gulf crisis broke out, Moscow saw it as a chance to emerge as probably try to slim chance, but still to emerge as a sort of an honest broker, vaguely hinting that it may help to shore up the differences between the two opposite camps. Let me make it clear, while divide and rule approach could have never worked with the Gulf states, and in fact was never applied by Moscow in dealing with the GCC countries, one of the unexpected results of the Gulf crisis was that its leading players diversified their foreign policy and tried to win global powers on their side. Incidentally or not, it was after the Gulf crisis that Russia activated its contacts with both Riyadh and Doha. So, to wrap it up, let me say that since the Middle East is undergoing one of the most dramatic upheavals in its history, which are marked by the configuration and realignment of its major players, be it global powers, regional powers, Russia's decision to go eastward and follow its proclaimed pivot to Asia under President Putin might one day mean that Moscow pursues a positive engagement with GCC countries after the years of animosity and hostilities. And let us keep fingers crossed it would work and it would be translated into developing joint enterprises, cementing regional security architecture after resolving major regional conflicts, number one, conflict in Syria, and prioritizing crisis prevention diplomacy. Thank you for your attention.
And now we move on to Europe, Germany. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I would like to thank the organization committee for inviting me. It's a great honor to be back after participating last year. Looking at today's conference program, I think it is remarkable that Germany finds room in a session called The Gulf Crisis, the Role of World Powers. For me as a German foreign policy analyst, I'm of course aware of Germany's growing appetite to project power internationally, or better say, to take more responsibility in international conflicts in the past 10 years or so. Nevertheless, until today, I would consider Germany a middle power and not a world power. Although Germany is the leading power within Europe, today the country is often described as an economic giant but a political dwarf. The Middle East is especially a relatively new territory to German foreign politics after World War II at least. The Gulf region was often referred to as an American chassé gardé by German commentators. I have to agree that a clear and comprehensive German foreign policy strategy towards the Middle East, except of maybe with regards to Iran or Israel, does not exist until today. That's why for a long time Udo Steinbach's description of the relations between Germany and the Middle East as a history of benign neglect holds true. However, this seems to have changed in recent years, which leads me to the core observation of my paper, the fact that one outcome of the recent Qatar crisis has been the emergence of Germany as a Western power embracing a role in diplomatic efforts to resolve the GCC rift. As the first Western state to defend Qatar on June 6, Germany, along with other Western countries, has played a pivotal role in terms of providing Doha with strong international support to counter pressure from the Saudi-UAE-led bloc. Germany's fast, clear and strong entry into the Qatar crisis as a diplomatic actor underscored Berlin's vested interests in its future landscape of the Arabian Peninsula and the Greater Middle East. My short speech today will look at the reasons for Germany's behavior in the Gulf crisis and also look at the question to what extent Germany can contribute to a more stable Middle East with regards to its historical low profile in the region and its limited military hard power. Is this one working? Oh, yes. Perfect. Yeah. Why is Germany's reaction to the Qatar crisis worth analyzing? As I already mentioned, a couple of years ago, in a case like the Qatar crisis, Germany would have most likely quietly sat back and watched what London and Paris would have done to eventually support their decisions in a concerted multilateral framework, while always being careful to not openly request a leading role in any conflict resolution. Today, in contrast, Germany gets actively engaged in the Middle Eastern conflicts, which touch its interests. This was obvious so with Germany's engagement in the P5+1 negotiations with Iran. Another example is Syria, where Germany did not get involved militarily in a direct way, but introduced the Friends of Syria group alongside France and worked on the Day After project, who sought to regime change in Syria. The Qatar crisis further underscores how Germany will get actively involved in regional matters. The case is all the more interesting since Germany has showed a foreign policy preference for a strong GCC since it was founded, which has resulted in a balanced approach in its bilateral relations to single GCC members, who are all important regional partners for Germany, especially so Qatar, KSA, and the UAE. With this history, the reaction of the German government towards the crisis is outstanding. Germany's Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel stated on June 6 that Germany is concerned about the Qatar's blockade and condemned such measures against Doha. He warned about another armed conflict in an already crisis-shaken region and stressed that the conflict touches upon German interests and therefore cannot remain in the hands of regional actors only. That explains his following 5-day trip to the region to help negotiate between the different parties and his several meetings with Qatari Foreign Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani to coordinate policies towards the Gulf Rift. On September 15th, Chancellor Merkel met the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim, in Berlin. In a common press conference, she stressed that whereas Germany is not an active party in the conflict, it is committed to contribute indirectly to a face-saving solution to end the Qatar crisis through its channels to all the 6 GCC members. She welcomed the Kuwaiti-led mediation efforts and the US role in the conflict. In addition, she emphasized that she will consult with other Gulf leaders and welcome them in Berlin as well. However, there was not such a high-level visit seen between Merkel and other Gulf leaders since the Qatar crisis started. Germany did not only contribute to the solution of the conflict by this head of governments meeting and a shuttle diplomacy by both the ministers of foreign affairs of Qatar and Germany, but also agreed to work even closer bilaterally in the field of security services. During Gabriel's visit to Qatar in June, the minister announced that the German Federal Intelligence Agency BND will help to look into the allegations of Qatar's neighbors in order to end the crisis. In addition, Germany shipped cows to Qatar to help overcome shortages in the local milk production caused by the crisis. The efforts of Germany to stand by Qatar's side were well received by the Qatari officials, who actively sought to build closer relations with Germany since 1999. During an exhibition opening in Doha in October on the occasion of the ongoing German Year of Culture, Sheikh Al-Mayassa, for example, thanked the attendees, amongst them the former German President Christian Wulff, our ambassador here, and the CEO of Volkswagen, Michael Müller, for Germany's support in difficult times, referring to the crisis. That leads us to the question, what interests does Germany pursue in its foreign policy towards Qatar, and what interests have prompted Germany to take these unusual, bold steps towards the crisis? Interviews I conducted for my PhD thesis about Qatari-German relations have shown that these relations within the past 15 years were mainly driven by economic interests. Even more important than the Qatari sales market for German companies, which benefited greatly from Doha's economic upswing in the mid-2005, became comprehensive Qatari investments into the German economy, and there are many prominent examples such as Deutsche Bank, Volkswagen Hof-Tief, and many others. In addition to economic cooperation, political relations have increased as well in recent years, with both countries cooperating in the fields of security policy. In 2009, a bilateral security agreement was signed. As part of the Gestaltungsmächte concept of the German government, which can be translated as new leading powers concept, Qatar was identified as an influential regional player and an important partner of German foreign policy in the Middle East and beyond. In 2013, Qatar even received heavy German war equipment such as Leopard 2 tanks, which constituted a new development to a rather restrictive German arms export policy towards Middle Eastern countries. The German foreign policy's rationale was to have alongside Saudi Arabia another partner within the GCC, which is more flexible in its foreign policy. With an active Qatari brokerage policy based on extensive financial resources and contacts with state and non-state actors, Doha contributed to diffuse regional conflicts in Germany's favor. In addition, the state increasingly played a role as Europe's energy partner, both in the area of LNG gas and in the case of Germany, especially so in the fields of renewable energies. Regional partners like Qatar have become crucial in recent years when Germany faces the growing threat of instability in the Arab world spilling into Western Europe and having direct consequences for German society. The most recent example is the almost 1 million Syrian refugees that were granted safe haven by the German government since 2015. Having said all this, with regards to the crisis, the crucial question is, what can Germany really offer? At this point, I would like to remind you that Germany neither has a direct military presence here in Qatar, nor is it a major energy importer of Qatari LNG gas. Nevertheless, Germany's efforts to mediate in the crisis and its will to support Qatar in the ongoing blockade was crucial for Qatar when the country reached out to its Western partners to defend its independence. Germany's reaction shows that the politically driven investment strategy of Qatar in Germany paid back. Germany was ready to defend Qatar's sovereignty, fearing that the ongoing crisis could not only affect Qatari investments in Germany, but also could force German companies to choose their preferred place of business within the GCC by not being allowed to doing business in the different conflict states at one time. Besides these rather economic reasons, Germany isn't interested in an unstable and weak GCC in an already conflict-torn region. A strong GCC is not only important to the fight against terror and counter other transnational risks, but also to end the conflicts in Yemen, Syria, and Libya. An obstacle for an even greater German role in the conflict in Qatar's favor was and remains to be the fact that Germany has economic interests in all GCC countries, which limits its mediation efforts to a certain extent. Nevertheless, German verbal support and its active role showed the world that Germany has an economic clout in this region, as well as vested security interests, which it is willing to defend while seeing itself not as a single player, but always in the Western camp. And let me finish by answering your initial question, Mr. Chairman, whether the position taken by Germany towards the crisis was a principled decision based on international law, realpolitik, or rather conventional wisdom of the importance of the region. I would say in the case of Germany, all three factors played a role. Germany followed a more realpolitik approach towards the GCC, latest since the Arab Spring, when German officials recognized the importance of the region, as I outlined in my speech. In addition, one of the basic Germany foreign policy principles is the promotion of international law and multilateral solutions to conflicts around the world. So this factor has also played a role, but I would say that Germany's reaction was primarily based on national interests, mainly the economic ones I outlined. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now we move to the EU and their position vis-à-vis the Gulf crisis. Ahmed?
شكرا سيد الرئيس. الحقيقة يعني الورقة هي راح تكون استجابة.
Matter of fact, my paper is a sort of response to what has been shown by the US or Russia and the German as well role in this regard. And we have chosen, or the Arab Center has chosen the role of Germany in order to be aware of. The European Union countries know the importance of the Arab countries, particularly in the rich Gulf region. The GCC has been in connection with the European market since the 80s. I don't want to go back to history, but I want to say that an agreement like such to be established in 1988 has its own considerations. The result of this agreement meant the necessity of having ministerial councils and meetings between both parties to boost and support the cooperation between in order to reach a free trade zone between Europe and the Gulf countries. The talks are still going on despite some obstacles. I will move to the Gulf crisis. That was a shock to the European countries and the international forces, and the European Union in Brussels has seen a lot of talks and conversations between parties that are related to the crisis. And the Federica Mogherini said in June during a meeting with the Qatari foreign minister, and she said that the European Union has good relations with all countries of the GCC, and the countries as a whole are friends of us. We need to keep and maintain our relations with the Gulf countries, and we think the regional cooperation in the Gulf region and in the Arab region as general is important for so many different reasons, because of working to fight terrorism and to stop financing terrorism. The regional cooperation in the Gulf is quite important for our security in Europe in order to achieve stability in the region as well. This is a very important matter, in addition to the commercial and economic relations. This reflects the policy of the European Union towards the region, particularly the big powers in the European Union. In addition to that, the European Union as a bloc, or the members as different countries, have reflected how important is the Gulf region for them, and also from a strategic viewpoint, in addition to the oil wealth in the region. The European Union is as similar as the American administration when it comes to the crisis. We remember during the Cold War, European Union or the big countries have been under the umbrella of the NATO. But on the other hand, we can see this in the Arab region, because in that region we have so many problems without defensive unified policies. These relations, the American-European relations, have seen some rifts between the European countries because of economy, politics, and security, like, for example, what happened during the Iraqi invasion, the US invasion to Iraq. ده بني آدم ده بالذمة؟
لا والله مش بني آدم.
And at the same time, we have seen rifts between the European countries that cannot reach a compromise regarding the Iraqi war. The crises have led the decision makers in Brussels to discuss the matter in the Gulf and to take the proper action to have a security common policy, not only related to the situation in Europe, but can go beyond to areas where they have interests, like the Gulf region. The Gulf region is very hot these days, and any turbulences might lead to so many problems, like terrorism, like illegal immigration, the economic problems that hit the Eurozone since 2008. When it comes to the European Union, we need to understand at the same time three main points: the economic interests, the outcome of the GCC countries was 1.6, and they have 50 million people living in the area. A lot of them are foreigners, and at the same time, such a wealth can put weight to the influence of the Gulf region, of the Gulf countries, when it comes to the economic relations with other countries. This is a fact, and the European Union, as an organization, as main powers, cannot ignore this. The Gulf countries like Qatar, and my colleague spoke about the investment in Germany and in so many other countries. The GCC countries have invested a lot of money in so many different forms in the European countries, and the GCC is a commercial partner to the European Union. 130.83 point something is the volume of the trade and commercial cooperation between the GCC countries and Europe. Also, we have seen engine, mechanical equipment, and we have also seen imports from the European Union from the GCC. That means there is a surplus in the trade between both parties, and between 2006 and 2016 has witnessed a boom when it comes to the trade relations between both countries, and the maximum was during 2013 due to the oil prices. The European Gulf relations had for some time gone through the framework of energy, and a partnership between Europe and the GCC has become very vital and important, and that's why we say the economic element and factor is quite important for why the superpowers have taken their positions towards the crisis in the Gulf. Something else, the relations between the Atlantic countries, though it's minimal, but it's a sort of a motive to the European Union to be more solid and to have clear idea, and this has been reflected to the way Brussels have dealt with the crisis in the Gulf. We have seen so many different strategies, not only toward the Gulf crisis, but toward other crises in the world. Also, there should be a sort of a balance between the European Union policy and the American policy when it comes to different problems in the world. We have seen also the lack of coordination between the US administration and the EU when it comes to the military intervention in different parts of the world. Donald Trump has caused a lot of problems to the Atlantic-Europe relations when it comes to the budget of the NATO, and he described NATO as an old-fashioned organization. He also attacked the policies of Angela Merkel in Germany, and this has been something that led to divisions between both parties or both blocs, the US and the EU. Also, the energy security, if I could say, and the Russian role in this regard is important to understand the Gulf crisis and different roles towards that crisis. On the other hand, we have seen the Russian role and its relations with Europe as very complicated, because we have seen the European Union importing a huge amount of gas from Russia. This will be increased by 2030 on 2040. That's why the the EU countries might suffer from different prices of energy through different periods or according to different problems. That's why it's quite important for the EU to have different sources to import energy, and they also have interest to keep the security in the Gulf region, because it's a region that is full of gas and oil. Also, we have seen the EU taking part or having a role in the Libyan crisis. Italy has quite a lot of interest in Italy, and this created different viewpoints amongst the European Union, supporting Khalifa Haftar or supporting the other side. Also, we have seen the coordination between Russia, Iran, and other parties when it comes to the crisis of Syria. This has put the EU in a critical situation for the future and in order to have a bigger role. Brussels has a vision to take into consideration the viewpoints of different parties to deal with the problems here and there. The EU has supported the initiative of the Emir of Kuwait to sort out the crisis in the Gulf, and this is a sort of a rejection to the unilateral situation or solutions. This means that they were against the Trump way. We can see the trade volume between the Gulf, the blockading countries, and Germany is way bigger than the volume of trade between Germany and Qatar. Despite that, we have seen the German side in support, in a way or another, to Qatar. And this might be one of the reasons why economy is important in this crisis. We have seen during the last years, particularly since the US invasion to Iraq in 2003, we have seen other powers taking part, and this results to rifts between the blocs and the countries. The EU has to work right now in order to sort out the crisis in the Gulf through political means and not to allow escalation to take part, so as to keep the security in the Gulf region. Iran is a friend. The Gulf is stable. This is quite important to the European Union. I will go through the different viewpoints of different countries, including Britain. putting into mind the Brexit. Of course, we have seen statements by the foreign minister when he said the Trump way of dealing with Qatar or with the Gulf crisis is not suitable. Germany hasn't developed its policies like France because the influence of Germany is not because of ambitions, but it's because of economic force. Germany is economically strong on the European and the Arab fields and domains, and this might help the Germans to achieve more successes in this regard. Germany is quite stable economically, and the relations between Berlin and the GCC are quite distinguished with their trade and economic dimensions. The German approach towards the GCC is not different than the EU policies towards the GCC. And the trade volume, when it comes to trade volume, Germany takes only 4% of its needs from the GCC, and I think the German foreign policy depends on this fact that Germany has always been assured that its needs of energy will be offered and given anytime Germany needs that, and the producing countries will, on the other hand, depend on industries that are supported by the German side. Also, there is a dialogue today amongst the German politics about a policy of defense in the Gulf region. We need not, in Germany they said, we need not to have only an embassy or an office, but we need to have ideas in order to expand the interest of Germany in the Gulf region and in the Middle East. The relations between Germany and the Gulf region is quite important, and the new policy depends on institutions that will work to sort out the problems in a peaceful way that guarantee the German interests in the region, like fighting terrorism, fighting extremism. I need to take more than 10 minutes more. The second force is France. France has a central role when it comes to the ambitions of France and the ambitions of the European Union. The relations between the world and France is quite distinguished, where the economy is playing an important role in this regard. From economy, France has moved to military, and weapons are there more than military equipment. Big military deals have been signed with the Gulf countries. France has started with the Arab world, and the French policies in the Arab region has been there according to the French strategic thought of the foreign policy overseas through a new defense doctrine.
And this gives us a clear idea about the French position. First of all, French also wants to act as if it's a major power, and try usually to have a say in the world. This is the Second World War, and the foreign policy in USA of France has not always followed the USA one. And despite and at the time of that aggression of the American force, France saw that as an opportunity to increase their influence in Africa, Middle East, and the Gulf area, so that they can have a role and influence in the region. And this is reflected on the needs and interest of France, needing energy. Saudi Arabia, the main exporter to France, and this link makes France very much interested in ensuring the power supplies it gets from the Gulf region. And the total exports of France to the Gulf is more than $4 billion a year, and France looks to increase that. The security and economic partnerships are important. The last part in is the military presence, which now I'll go in a fast way into my conclusions. Thank God he's not giving me time. I'm sorry we began late, and we have 4 speakers on this panel. In fact, it's putting pressure on us. As we had to end this panel, as for the announcement, if you are on a diet, you can go to the cafeteria now. The lunch is not here today. There is no food in the cafeteria. The only one who wants to have lunch must go to the buses. After the class at 12:30, bus will leave here to the hotel where the lunch will be served in hotel. Then after lunch and 5:15, 5:30, the bus will bring you back here to the last session of this forum, which will be attended by His Excellency the Foreign Minister of Qatar. If you have only urgent questions, we can make a couple of questions on law. So I want
الكلمة حقيقة اللي
In
أنا
fact, I was surprised that the speaker from Germany and Dr. Ahmed Qasem, they did not speak about something important, which is a key word in the European Gulf relations, which is immigration. Immigration is a very sensitive issue nowadays for Europe. What is the relationship of immigration to this crisis? The Gulf states have a big number of Arab citizens who are living through these troublesome areas. That say if there is any new troubles in the region, this means more immigrants going to Europe, and this gives an incentive to Europe to calm down the situation here, not to receive more immigrants.
You have talked about the kind of perception which Saudi Arabia and Qatar have received in Russian media. May I ask you one question, that is Russia forced to change its position to Qatar and Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries because of the fact that there is also a change of perception about Russia in popular Arab media, as it is being identified as Quwwatul Ihtilal al-Rusi, and very anti-Sunni country which is very much aligning with Iran, and also a country which has very huge military ambitions in this region, to replace American imperialism with Russian imperialism. Do you also think that this perception is also changing your position?
Sergey, would you like
Yeah, sure.
to that?
Sure. Thank you for that question. In fact, this is not the first time we are discussing this puzzle of Russia's Gulf countries' relations. And Marwan is not here, but he could have proved that, there was a lot of heated debate over that, because we all agreed that Russia's stand on Syria used a stumbling block in Russia's relations with Gulf countries, and it poisoned them. So Russia was considered to be highly toxic for the countries, and that was similar to Russia's approach to Gulf countries. So the media coverage you are referring to is probably an echo of that mutual animosity. But let me make ourselves clear, and this is the basic difference in Russia's position from Iranian position. We don't want to stay in Syria forever. We don't want Syria to be stumbling block. We understand that Gulf.
How long?
You see, we understand that we see this Gulf as a land of, as a region of opportunities. Whereas Iranians, they are tricky enough. They want to drag us in the Syrian mud and not to get out of that. So this is the problem, you see. So the main question lies ahead: to what extent we would be able to outsmart Iranians and to get out of Syria and to get rid of Assad at the moment. At the moment, we can't do it today, but at the moment we realize that we can convert what we have achieved in Syria militarily into political, economic leverage. You see, this is the main thing. And I think as this Syrian crisis will fade away, every crisis comes to an end one day. We will see more approachment in media coverage as well. As far as imperialism, I don't think this is appropriate language to talk about American imperialism or Russian imperialism. So the time of empires has gone.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, join me in thanking our speakers, please, for their presentation. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience and for your attendance today. Thank you very much.